Montana Territory, 1868. Jack Callahan wiped the sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dirt across his weathered forehead. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the parched land, turning the world into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. His ranch, 400 acres of stubborn earth that had taken everything from him and given precious little in return, stretched toward the distant mountains like a broken promise. 7 years a widower. 7 years since Mary had drawn her last breath, leaving him with nothing but calloused hands and a heart turned to stone. The house stood empty, save for the ghosts of what might have been. Children's laughter, a woman's soft touch, family meals around the oak table he'd carved himself during those first hopeful months of marriage. Mr. Callahan, Sheriff Davis's voice cut through Jack's thoughts. The lawman sat uncomfortably in his saddle, sweat darkening his shirt beneath his arms. "You sure about this? Ain't nobody gonna think less of you if you change your mind." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked past the sheriff to the young woman sitting rigidly on the wagon bench. She appeared to be about 16. Her copper skin stretched taut over high cheekbones, and her black hair hung in a single braid down her back. She stared straight ahead, refusing to meet his gaze. "The agreement stands," Jack finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "The Indian agent said she's good with horses and knows farming. I need the help." The words came out harsher than he intended, but tenderness had been buried alongside Mary. "She don't talk much," Sheriff Davis said, lowering his voice. "Agent says her people faced hardships some years back. Been at the reservation since. Knows English well enough, though. Schooled by them missionaries." Jack nodded once. He didn't need conversation. He needed someone who understood the rhythm of the land, who could work without complaint. "What's her name?" he asked, realizing he should at least know that much. "Aiyana," the sheriff replied. "Means eternal blossom or some such. That's what the agent told me." Jack almost snorted at the irony. Nothing bloomed eternally in this land. Everything withered eventually. Crops, livestock, people. "Miss Aiyana," he called, his voice carrying on the dry air. She turned then, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. In them he saw neither fear nor hope, only a quiet resignation that mirrored something in his own soul. A recognition passed between them, wordless and profound. They were both survivors in a world that had tried its best to break them. "This is your home now," he said simply, gesturing to the modest 2-story farmhouse and the sprawling land beyond. "You'll have your own room, 3 meals, fair treatment." He paused. "In return, you work. With the horses, the crops, the house. You understand?" Aiyana nodded once, her face impassive. Then she gathered her small bundle and climbed down from the wagon with a fluid grace that spoke of a strength belied by her slender frame. Sheriff Davis shifted uncomfortably. "There's papers to sign. The agency requires—" "I know what they require." Jack cut him off, turning toward the house. "Come inside. Let's get it done." As they walked to the house, Jack was acutely aware of the young woman following several paces behind, her footsteps nearly silent on the hard-packed earth. This wasn't charity or kindness that motivated him, just the practical reality of a man alone on a struggling ranch. He needed help, and she needed somewhere to go. A simple transaction, nothing more. The first month passed in near silence. Aiyana learned the routines of the ranch quickly, rising before dawn without being told, tending to the horses with a natural ability that even Jack had to privately acknowledge was impressive. She moved through the days like a shadow, completing tasks efficiently and disappearing into her small room after the evening meal. One evening, as summer began its slow surrender to fall, Jack returned from town to find Aiyana kneeling in what had once been Mary's garden, a small plot beside the house that had gone to weeds years ago. Her hands moved methodically through the soil, pulling weeds, turning earth. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Aiyana looked up, pushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She didn't startle at his sudden appearance. "Garden," she said simply. Then after a pause, she added, For winter. Store vegetables. It was the most words she'd strung together since her arrival, and Jack found himself momentarily at a loss for response. Mary had always put by stores for winter. He hadn't bothered since her passing. "The soil's not good here," he said finally. "Mary, my wife, she tried for years." Aiyana's eyes flickered at the mention of his wife, the first time he'd spoken of her aloud in the young woman's presence. "Different plants," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "From my people, will grow." She returned to her work, the conversation clearly finished in her mind. Jack watched her a moment longer, then turned away, unsettled by the memory of Mary in that same spot, her face bright with hope at the beginning of each growing season. That night, as the wind picked up outside, promising the first real cold snap of the season, Jack sat at his desk reviewing the ledgers that tracked the ranch's meager profits. A soft knock at the study door roused him from his dark thoughts. Aiyana stood in the doorway, a steaming cup in her hands. Without a word, she entered and placed it on the desk beside him. The rich, earthy aroma of herbs rose with the steam. Jack eyed it suspiciously. "What's this?" "Tea," she said. "For sleep." He couldn't remember telling her about his troubled nights, the hours he spent pacing the floor or sitting on the porch until dawn, haunted by memories and failures. Yet somehow she knew. "I don't need," he began, but she had already turned to leave, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Jack stared at the cup for a long moment after she'd gone. Then, with a resigned sigh, he picked it up and took a cautious sip. The flavor was unfamiliar, bitter at first, then surprisingly sweet at the back of his throat. By the time he finished, a warm heaviness had settled into his limbs. That night, Jack Callahan slept through until morning for the first time in 7 years. When he woke, the cup had been removed from his desk, and the scent of coffee drifted from the kitchen. He found Aiyana already at work, her hair neatly braided, her movements efficient as she prepared a simple breakfast. Their eyes met briefly as he entered the kitchen. No words passed between them, but something had shifted, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that their arrangement might be more than just a transaction after all. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of promise Jack had long since stopped noticing. Winter came early that year, harsh and unforgiving. The first snow fell in late October, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that quickly turned treacherous as temperatures plummeted and winds howled across the open plains. Jack and Aiyana fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity, feeding livestock, breaking ice on water troughs, maintaining the endless vigilance required to survive the Montana winter. They worked side by side most days, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, their words few but increasingly comfortable. By December, Aiyana had been at the ranch for 5 months, though it sometimes felt to Jack like she had always been there. Her presence had become as much a part of his daily existence as the mountains on the horizon or the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The young woman had transformed his Spartan existence in subtle ways he was only beginning to recognize. The house smelled of the herbs she hung to dry from the kitchen rafters. The pantry was stocked with the vegetables from her garden, preserved through methods he didn't understand but didn't question. On the coldest nights, he would find an extra quilt, woven in patterns he didn't recognize, placed at the foot of his bed. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Jack sat before the fire repairing a broken bridle. Aiyana sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, grinding something in a stone mortar. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her features, softening them, reminding Jack that she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years. "What are you making?" he asked, nodding toward her work. "Medicine," she replied without looking up. "For Thunder." Thunder was Jack's prized stallion, a temperamental sorrel that had been favoring his left foreleg for the past week. Jack had been considering putting the animal down if he didn't improve, a thought that filled him with dread, as the horse was the finest he'd ever owned. "No white man's medicine will help him," Jack said, returning to the bridle in his hands. Aiyana's hands stilled. This is not white man's medicine." Something in her tone made Jack look up. Her eyes, usually carefully neutral, held a spark of defiance. "My grandmother was healer," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She taught me before the troubles came. I can help Thunder." It was the most she had ever revealed about her past, and Jack found himself at a loss for how to respond. "You lost your family?" he asked quietly. Aiyana's eyes dropped back to the mortar in her hands. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind and the crackling of the fire. "Yes," she finally said, her voice so low Jack had to strain to hear it. "During a difficult time for my people." Her hands resumed their grinding, more forceful now. "I alone survived from my immediate family." Jack's throat constricted. He had never asked about her past, had never wanted to know. It was easier that way, to see her as just help around the ranch, to keep the wall between them intact. "How old were you?" he asked. 11 summers, she replied. So young to face such loss. Jack closed his eyes briefly, unable to stop the images that flooded his mind. "After that," Aiyana continued, her voice taking on a distant quality, "men came, not soldiers, men in black coats. They took those of us who survived, put us in different places." Her eyes lifted to meet his, and in them Jack saw not just the shadow of that trauma, but a resilience that humbled him. "5 winters I was moved, then you." The simple equation of her life hung in the air between them. 5 years of being passed from place to place, unwanted or merely tolerated, until the arrangement that brought her to his door. "I'm sorry," Jack said, the words inadequate even to his own ears. Aiyana shook her head once, decisively. "No sorry," she said. "You gave home. Work." After a brief hesitation, she added, "Purpose." She rose gracefully to her feet, the bowl of medicine cradled in her hands. "I will go to Thunder now." "It's freezing out there," Jack protested, rising as well. "The storm—" "He suffers," she said simply, already moving toward the door where her heavy coat hung. Jack watched her pull on the coat, one of his old ones, much too large for her frame, and wrap a woolen scarf around her head. Without another word, she disappeared into the howling whiteness, leaving him standing alone by the fire. Spring arrived late but gloriously, turning the Montana landscape into a riot of wildflowers and fresh green growth. Thunder, thanks to Aiyana's mysterious medicine, had made a full recovery. The stallion now followed her around the corral like an oversized puppy, much to Jack's amazement and the amusement of the 2 ranch hands he'd hired to help with the increased workload. For the ranch was prospering. Aiyana's garden had yielded hardy vegetables throughout the winter, supplementing their stores and allowing them to sell the surplus in town. Her way with the horses had resulted in 2 exceptional foals that promised to fetch top prices, and her quiet presence in the house had somehow transformed it from merely a place where Jack slept and ate into something he had not experienced since Mary's death, a home. The summer of 1870 brought changes to the Callahan ranch that neither Jack nor Aiyana could have anticipated. 2 years had passed since the young woman from the reservation had stepped onto his land, and in that time, something unexpected had taken root and flourished between them. Not romance, not yet, but a deep companionship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Aiyana, now a young woman of 18, had grown into her strength. No longer the quiet, watchful newcomer who followed Jack's instructions without question, she had become his partner in the truest sense of the word. Her knowledge of plants had transformed the once struggling ranch into one of the most productive in the territory. The horses she bred and trained fetched top prices at auction, and Jack, against all odds, had rediscovered something he thought had died with Mary: the capacity for joy. It was Aiyana who suggested they expand, who convinced Jack to purchase the adjacent property when Old Man Henderson decided to return east. It was Aiyana who negotiated with the Blackfoot traders for better breeding stock, who introduced new farming techniques that doubled their yield. And it was Aiyana whose presence in his life had drawn attention. not all of it welcome. "You've done well for yourself, Callahan," Emmett Walsh drawled, his eyes following Aiyana as she moved confidently among the horses in the corral. They were at the summer auction in Helena, and the Callahan horses had just fetched the highest prices of the day. "Real well?" Jack recognized the look in Walsh's eyes, a mixture of envy, speculation, and something darker that made his jaw tighten. "The ranch is prospering," he replied neutrally, deliberately misunderstanding. Walsh snorted, taking a swig from his flask. "Wasn't talking about the ranch." He nodded toward Aiyana. "That Indian lady of yours, she's quite something, isn't she? Wouldn't mind having help like that around my place." Jack's hand curled into a fist at his side, but he kept his voice level. "Miss Aiyana is my business partner, Walsh. I suggest you remember that." Walsh's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Miss Aiyana, is it? And business partner? That what they're calling it these days?" He leaned closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "Come on, Callahan. We're both men of the world. Everyone knows why you took in a young—" Jack's fist connected with Walsh's jaw before the man could finish his sentence. Walsh stumbled backward, more surprised than hurt, then lunged forward with a roar of anger. The two men crashed into a nearby stall, sending horses skittering and people shouting in alarm. "Jack!" Aiyana's voice cut through the commotion. She appeared at the edge of the growing crowd, her eyes wide with concern. The sight of her momentarily distracted Jack, and Walsh took advantage, landing a solid punch to Jack's ribs that drove the air from his lungs. Jack doubled over, gasping, then straightened with a growl and drove his shoulder into Walsh's midsection, sending both men to the ground. They were separated by the sheriff and two deputies before any real damage could be done. Walsh was escorted away, shouting insults and threats, while Jack stood catching his breath, acutely aware of the spectators and the whispers that rippled through the crowd. "What happened?" Aiyana asked quietly, her hand on his arm. The simple touch grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of his anger. "Nothing worth repeating," Jack muttered, wincing as he probed his bruised ribs. "Walsh has a big mouth, that's all." Aiyana's eyes, dark and knowing, searched his face. "He spoke of me," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack couldn't bring himself to confirm it, but his silence was answer enough. Aiyana's hand fell away from his arm, and he immediately missed the contact. "We should go," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The horses are sold. There's nothing more for us here." The ride back to the ranch was conducted mostly in silence. Jack was lost in thoughts he'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. Thoughts about Aiyana, about the way she had transformed from a young woman in need of a place to stay to a capable adult whose strength and intelligence he had come to rely on. Thoughts about the way his heart raced when she smiled at him, the way his day felt incomplete until he had seen her, spoken with her. As they crested the final hill before their ranch, a plume of black smoke on the horizon caught Jack's attention. "Fire!" he said, immediately snapping the reins to urge the horses to a gallop. Aiyana's hand flew to her mouth in alarm, and then they were racing toward home, all other concerns temporarily forgotten in the face of this new threat. The scene that greeted them made Jack's blood run cold. The barn was engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly toward the corral where the remaining horses moved nervously. Several men on horseback circled the property, their identities concealed by bandanas pulled up over their faces. "Walsh!" Jack growled, reaching for the rifle stored beneath the wagon seat. They left the wagon concealed behind a stand of trees and approached on foot, using the cover of smoke and the raiders' preoccupation with the burning barn to their advantage. Through the smoke and chaos, Jack caught glimpses of Aiyana as she reached the corral and began opening the gates, freeing the nervous horses. Her movements were fluid and assured, her focus absolute despite the danger surrounding her. Pride surged through Jack, followed immediately by fear as he saw Walsh himself wheeling his horse around, heading straight for Aiyana, with malevolent intent clear in every line of his body. "Aiyana!" Jack shouted, breaking cover to run toward her. "Behind you!" She turned just as Walsh reached her, his hand outstretched to grab her. With a grace born of years working with horses, Aiyana sidestepped his grasp, caught hold of his saddle, and used his own momentum to pull herself up behind him on the horse. The struggle was brief but intense. A shot rang out, then another. Jack couldn't tell who had fired or where the bullets had gone. His heart in his throat, he ran toward them as they disappeared into a thick cloud of smoke. When he emerged on the other side, Walsh's horse was galloping away riderless. On the ground, two figures lay motionless, Walsh unmoving, and Aiyana crumpled beside him, eyes closed. "No," Jack breathed, the word a prayer and a denial all at once. He covered the remaining distance in a few desperate strides and fell to his knees beside Aiyana. Her shoulder was injured, but when he gently turned her over, her eyes fluttered open. "Jack," she whispered, her voice strained with pain. "Don't speak," he urged, quickly assessing her wound. "You're going to be fine. Just hold on." Around them, the tide of the battle had turned. Walsh's men, seeing their leader fallen, were retreating, disappearing into the landscape as quickly as they had come. The barn was a total loss, but the fire had not reached the house. The freed horses had scattered but could be rounded up later. None of that mattered to Jack as he lifted Aiyana in his arms and carried her toward the house. All that mattered was that she was alive, that he hadn't lost her to Walsh's vengeance. "Stay with me," he murmured, a litany repeated with each step. "Stay with me, Aiyana." Fall came to Montana like a whispered promise, painting the world in golds and ambers before the inevitable white of winter. 3 months had passed since the attack on the ranch, 3 months of healing, for Aiyana, for the land, for Jack himself. The barn had been rebuilt, stronger than before, with the help of neighbors who had put aside their whispers and suspicions in the face of Walsh's treachery. The man had not survived the confrontation. His actions ruled as an attack that had been defended against. His surviving accomplices were awaiting trial. Life at the Callahan ranch had slowly returned to its rhythm, but with subtle changes that marked a new beginning. Aiyana's recovery had been steady. Her physical strength returned gradually, her shoulder healing to leave a small scar as the only reminder of that day. But the greater transformation had been in her spirit, in the quiet confidence that now radiated from her, born of the knowledge that she had fought for what was hers and prevailed. Jack, too, had changed. The walls he had maintained for so long, between himself and the world, between himself and Aiyana, had crumbled in the wake of nearly losing her. He found himself speaking more openly, laughing more freely, touching her hand or shoulder in small gestures of affection that would have been unthinkable before. On an unusually warm October afternoon, Jack stood on the newly built porch, watching Aiyana as she worked with a young colt in the corral. Now 20, she moved with fluid grace as she guided the nervous animal through its paces, her voice a soothing murmur that carried on the breeze. The sight stirred something in Jack's chest, a longing so acute it was almost painful. 4 years she had been with him, 4 years of growing respect, deepening trust, and unspoken devotion. Yet still he hesitated to cross the final boundary between them, held back by doubt and the weight of responsibility. "She's got away with them, doesn't she?" The voice startled Jack from his thoughts. He turned to find Sheriff Davis standing beside him, hat in hand, his expression troubled despite the casual greeting. "Sheriff," Jack acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't hear you ride up. Didn't mean to sneak up on you," Davis replied, his eyes drifting to Aiyana in the corral. "Just came by to give you some news. Thought you should hear it from me directly." Something in the sheriff's tone put Jack on alert. "What kind of news?" Davis sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's a man in town. Government man, name of Hollister. Works for the Indian Affairs Bureau." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "He's asking questions about Aiyana." Jack's body tensed, his hand instinctively tightening on the porch railing. "What kind of questions?" "About her people, mostly. Where she came from. Says he's trying to identify survivors of some trouble back in '63. Says there's money involved, reparations or some such." Jack frowned. "Reparations? After all this time?" Davis shrugged. That's what he claims, but there's something else. The sheriff lowered his voice, though Aiyana was too far away to hear. He says he's looking for the last surviving member of the Bear clan. Says they were medicine people, keepers of sacred knowledge. Says the government wants to make things right. Jack's gaze returned to Aiyana, watching as she pressed her forehead against the Colt's, a gesture of communion he had seen her use countless times. A memory surfaced, Aiyana healing thunder during that long-ago blizzard, the quiet power and beauty she invoked. After the sheriff departed, Jack remained on the porch, his thoughts churning. He had always known on some level that Aiyana was special, that her knowledge of healing and plants went beyond what could be easily explained. But the idea that she might be the last of a line of medicine people, the sole keeper of her clan's sacred traditions, it cast her presence in his life in an entirely new light. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in spectacular shades of crimson and gold, Aiyana released the Colt and made her way toward the house. Jack watched her approach, struck anew by the grace in her movements, the quiet dignity she carried like a birthright. "We had a visitor?" she asked, nodding toward the retreating figure of the sheriff in the distance. "Sheriff Davis came with a warning," he said, gesturing for her to join him on the porch. "There's a government man in town asking questions about survivors of your people, specifically about someone from the Bear clan." Aiyana's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, a momentary widening of her eyes before her features composed themselves once more. "My grandmother was the medicine woman of the Bear clan," she said softly. "She was teaching me when the troubles came. She made me promise, before she passed." Aiyana swallowed hard, then continued with visible effort. "She made me promise to keep the knowledge alive, to remember the songs, the medicines, the sacred stories." She turned to face Jack fully then, her eyes reflecting both vulnerability and strength. "I am the last. When I die, the Bear clan dies with me." The simple statement hung in the air between them, its implications staggering. Jack thought of the herbs she grew so carefully, the songs she hummed to the horses, the intricate knowledge of the natural world that had transformed their ranch. All of it, pieces of a heritage she had been preserving in silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. No accusation in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Aiyana's smile was tinged with sadness. "At first, because I did not trust. Then, because I did not want to burden you with my responsibility." Her hand moved unconsciously to touch her shoulder. "And perhaps, because I feared you would see me differently, as something other than just Aiyana." Jack shook his head, reaching out to take her hand in his. "You have never been just Aiyana to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not from the first day." The admission hung between them, charged with all the unspoken feelings that had grown over their years together. Aiyana's fingers tightened around his, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his heart race. Before either could speak again, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Through the gathering dusk, they could make out 3 horsemen coming fast down the road toward the ranch. Too fast for a social call, too purposeful to be passing by. The well-dressed man at the center urged his horse forward, a thin smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Callahan, I presume. My name is Hollister, Bureau of Indian Affairs." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm looking for a young woman who I believe resides here. A survivor of the Bear clan." Jack's expression remained impassive. "Don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Hollister. It's just me and the ranch hands here." Aiyana stepped forward, her chin raised in quiet defiance. "This is private property," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You are not welcome here." Hollister stared at her with undisguised interest, his eyes taking in her distinctive features, the proud set of her shoulders. "So, you are the one," he said softly. "The last of the Bear clan medicine people." "I am Aiyana of the Callahan ranch," she replied, deliberately emphasizing the name she had made her own. "This is my home. You will leave now." For a tense moment, It seemed Hollister might press the issue. Then a jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The horses reared nervously, nearly unseating their riders. "This isn't over," one of the men called as they struggled to control their mounts. But the threat sounded hollow, delivered as they retreated in disarray down the road. Jack and Aiyana stood side by side on the porch, watching until the riders disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did Jack turn to her, a question in his eyes. "There's another option," he said quietly. "One that might give us more protection under the law." Aiyana looked up, a question in her eyes. "Marriage," he said simply. "If you were my wife, legally, it would be harder for Hollister to separate us, to take you away." The word hung in the air between them, charged with meaning beyond its practical implications. Aiyana's expression was unreadable as she absorbed his proposal, for that was what it was, however pragmatically framed. "You would marry me to protect me from Hollister?" she asked carefully. Jack moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes, to count the steady pulse at the base of her throat. "No," he said honestly. "I would marry you because I love you, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it, because every good thing that has come to me in the past 4 years has come through you." Aiyana's eyes searched his face, as if looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she squeezed his hands gently. "In my tradition," she said softly, "a man and woman who wish to join their lives speak their intentions to the earth and sky, to the ancestors who watch over them. They make promises not just to each other but to the land that sustains them." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "I have already made those promises in my heart, Jack Callahan. I would make them before any judge or preacher if that is what you ask." Joy surged through Jack's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Is that a yes?" he asked, needing to hear the words. Aiyana's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Yes," she said simply. "I will be your wife, in the eyes of your law and mine." Outside, a storm continued to rage, but within the sturdy walls of the house, they had made a home. Jack pulled Aiyana into his arms at last. Their first kiss was gentle, almost reverent. A sealing of promises long in the making, a beginning rather than an end. For in the end, it was the land that had recognized what they belonged to each other long before they had admitted it themselves. The land that had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately blessed their union. The land that would remember their story long after they were gone. The story of Jack and Aiyana Callahan, and the love that had bloomed against all odds in the wild heart of the American West. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this unforgettable story. If it touched your heart, please help our channel grow by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing. Your support is what keeps us inspired to tell more stories of love, redemption, and unexpected turns of fate. At the end of this video, you'll find another powerful story suggestion from our channel. Click and be surprised by more deeply emotional tales like this one. See you in the next story.